We are recording this new segment just after the 1-year anniversary of the FDA and the USDA giving clearance to a couple of companies, Upside Foods and Good Meat, which is a division of Eat Just, to sell their cultivated meat products in the US. And that reminded me of an article from the New York Times that came out back in February that we read, that I actually saw shared on LinkedIn. And I thought that this might be the perfect opportunity to not only discuss that article and look at how these businesses have fared over the last year, but as always, get some of your insights into what we can take away from stories like this.
Okay. All right. I think I might have some things to say about cultured meat. Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, Sarah, I want you to imagine a future where meat is grown in advanced sterile facilities, where no animals are harmed, and there's minimal environmental impact. Okay. This is the vision that captivated investors who poured nearly $3 billion into startups like Eat Just and Upside Foods that I mentioned before. There was backing from heavyweights like SoftBank, major meat packers like Tyson, Cargill, and JBS. And they even had celebrity endorsements from people like Leonardo DiCaprio. However, a February New York Times investigation by Joe Fassler titled "The Revolution That Died on Its Way to Dinner" reveals an industry struggling with, quote, squandered resources, broken promises, and unproven science.
This is really interesting for a number of reasons. I think, Chelsea, you and I have talked here on the podcast before about what I'll call investment in food technology. And I've shared my opinions on how I have a hope or a wish that such investment would be given to food infrastructure, particularly regenerative farming, sustainable farming. I personally work with farmers, ranchers, fishers who, gosh, if they had a fraction of that $3 billion that was invested into the cultivated meat industry, the things that they could do, not just to produce protein and meat for people, but to do it in a way that regenerates the land, does things like improve or take steps toward reversing some of the the global warming that is happening, really heal the land, bring back the bugs and the birds and certain animals that we're losing due to conventional farming, right? And other things going on in our food industry. And so just off the bat, it just sort of, to be really transparent, it's frustrating to me to see this much money going into an industry that had no real proof of concept. And I think that's why it's so difficult for me. And as I was reading the article, when you shared it with me, as we're prepping for the conversation, I pulled out a section and I want to read it here. It says, Steve Molino, who is a principal at Clear Current Capital, an early stage venture food focused on sustainable food and an early backer of Blue Nalu, which was cell-grown bluefin tuna. He's no stranger to the practice of, quote, placing big bets with limited information. But even so, he was amazed to see the way that money poured into the industry. He says there was no real numbers to pull from that allowed anyone to say, wait a second, this is either going to not work, or if it does, it's going to take a really long time. So without that data, he said someone could give you a tiny sample of something and you're like, holy crap, this is the future. So all of this money poured in to sort of restate what he said with no real information or way to validate how much time, effort, and money it would truly take to produce a viable product. And so, not to skip to the end here, but, like as you said, squandered resources, right? At the end of the day, the industry is not moving forward. in the way that people thought it was going to. And now the funding is drying up for the companies that are still in existence. And I know that we'll kind of dig into that, a little bit further, but I continue to be frustrated by these stories of such immense capital investment in unproven areas.
Yeah, and I think that you so eloquently boiled it down in the difference between regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, and this cultivated, meat, or we could even just say cultivated food industry. I don't even know what we want to call it, right? But is that proof of concept, and it kind of blows my mind that any investor wants to put money where they don't see the proof of concept.
Yeah. I think one thing I'll say, and we talked about this in a prior news segment, is that we are seeing investment funds and general business like investments and ventures into the regenerative space. And that is a change that I am happy to be seeing. And I think it's, as we discussed, on the heels of sort of disappointment in the outcomes of investments made in certain food technologies. I think the other thing that you bring up here, Chelsea, is the who did the investing. Yes, we had, capital, investment funds and kind of big banks, but we also had big meat. You pointed out Tyson, Cargill, and JBS. And to me, what this screams is continued consolidation in the food industry. So we already know that these companies have a great control over the supply chain. They have great control over how much farms and farm workers get paid, right? There's a lot of ethical problems within these corporations, on many levels. And they saw this as a potential direction for where the meat industry would go in the future. And so their investment in this industry was a means of maintaining a certain level of control and consolidation. And in my mind, if this did work out, or if someday in the future this works out, I absolutely could see, big meat buying up these, quote unquote smaller companies and, folding them in.
Yeah, that's exactly where my mind was going, because not only buying up these companies, but if you think about who are the players out there that have the resources to create, as we're going to talk about in a moment, right? These almost like mega facilities, right? If this were to be the future of food, yeah, it's going to be those big three, right?
Yeah. And I think, if we step back a second, like, outside of this article, and we just think about consolidation of the food industry in general, right? And I don't know if I've ever said this explicitly. Perhaps I have said it, here on the podcast. But one of the reasons that I am such a strong proponent of, champion of building regional and local businesses is in support of consolidation, right, of the food industry. And it's not something that's going to change overnight. It's not something that changed overnight from, small downtowns with, independently owned businesses in it to, Walmarts in every city. That didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to undo itself, period. And we're not going to undo it, overnight. But I think that as we think about being a Bobby Yachts and think about how do we want to build our businesses and what do we want for ourselves, for our teams, for our communities from that, I hope that we start to see the return of more and more regional businesses to fight these conglomerates, really. And I see it day to day in my work with the farmers and ranchers and founders that I work with. So I feel like it's promising, and I want to echo that here as well.
I think that's great. And to round this story out, right, and to put a bow on it, what we are seeing is that, as you kind of already mentioned, since 2022, the explosive investment in cultivated meat has begun to dry up altogether.
Yeah.
The article cites unrealistic timelines, scaling issues, and unsustainable costs as the major culprits. Companies have consistently overpromised and underdelivered. The CEO of Upside Foods claimed in 2016 that in just a few years, we expect to be selling protein-packed pork, beef, and chicken. Now, That was in 2016,
Yeah.
right? But 8 years later, there are no products available in stores. And then you have Upside Foods, who've been producing chicken cutlets almost by hand in like teeny tiny quantities using disposable plastic bottles, and basically having a process that is definitely unscalable and unsustainable. And then Dave Humbird, who is a biotech expert, published a peer-reviewed analysis concluding that production costs would likely preclude the affordability of these products as food.
Yeah. I think, something that's striking me here, Chelsea, is that I love innovation. I love people believing that they can create something new and different. I love that mentality and that way of thinking. But to take a lot of money on a promise and not follow through, I think the expectation would be that the funding would dry up, right? And I think in the article it talks about how in 2022, May actually of 2022, Good Meat announced their plans to build 2 factories, one in Singapore and one in the United States. So 2 locations that had, the approval to sell the cultivated meat. And they were going to be mega facilities housing up to 10 250,000 liter bioreactors so that they could produce millions of pounds of meat. So they were really taking big, expensive next steps to build infrastructure without proof of concept, without viability, And I think that that's really interesting. If we were going to take that and turn it into a lesson learned for a founder, it might be like, don't get too far ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Really know what you're capable of. I mean, that facility, according to, the article at the time that it was printed, is not built. There's some legal battles going on between Good Meat and the construction company that was intended to build it. When the author of the article visited Eat Just in January of 2024, the company was in the process of downsizing from 2 buildings into 1. And earlier in 2023, they had laid off 80 employees. So there was a lot of downsizing happening. And reportedly, one of their large investors had pulled the funding and was turning to real estate investment instead, something that had a bit more predictable, I would think, return on investment. So, I think there's a lot we can learn from any article about investment, any article about, a food venture that didn't work out. I just hope that soon, Chelsea, you and I are reading and sharing more news articles about investment in food infrastructure that has to do with, good farming practices and sustainability and things of that nature.
Is in harmony with,
Yeah.
with our planet.
Exactly.
Because we want it to be here for a long, long time.
True. Yep.
Well, not sure if I mentioned this already, but I'll go ahead and say we definitely will link to this article in the show notes so that you can read the whole thing. I mean, we just scratched the surface with this one. It is a very long and very informative piece.
Yeah.